Okay, I got 6 o'clock by my watch. We'll go ahead. Paul, if you haven't started recording, please go ahead and do so and broadcast. Welcome out to the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan public meeting. We're going to go ahead and kick things off by having our state engineer do introductions and welcome. So, Teresa.
Thanks, Blake. So really glad to see everyone that came out tonight. We've got some great information to show with you. The links are live on our webpage now, so you can click on the information. And I'm just going to do a quick shout out to two of our staff that really helped pull this information together. And it's Blake Bingham, who's the Deputy State Engineer, and David Jones, who is one of our technical services engineers that it's in the back. So super proud of being able to work with these folks and all the staff of the division to be able to bring this tool together. So Blake, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Teresa. We'll kind of get out. This is our agenda tonight. We've already had the welcome and introduction. So I'm going to kind of follow the format of the plan, and we'll kind of do an overview of all the sections, and then we'll go section by section. If you have a question, I'm fine with answering questions as we go. I might say, well, wait, we'll get to that at some point. I'll just repeat your question rather than trying to pass the microphone unless you really want the mic and you want to broadcast your own voice. And then, of course, throughout the conversation. And then once we've kind of gone through the plan itself, I'll turn over to my desktop or my laptop here and show you the model that David's worked so hard on. I think it's going to be really insightful, and it's something we're pretty excited about. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this is just the enabling legislation. So back in 2023, Representative Snyder and Senator Sandel passed House Bill 453. Had a lot of provisions having to do with forestry, fire, and state lands, but also directed the state engineer to develop this Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan and kind of specified some of the factors that the state engineer would look at in the development and adoption of the plan, as well as the accounting model and those types of things. So like I said, we'll kind of go through the plan. We do have handouts over there that has a copy of this draft plan. These are the sections. It's essentially 9 sections in the plan itself. Starts off with background and introductions, some defining terms. We talk about Great Salt Lake water rights, also the water that's been dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. And then kind of the meat of the plan itself is this apportionment and distribution with a priority schedule. Suspect there may be some questions or comments on that. We'll talk about voluntary arrangements and then the distribution accounting tool in the plan. It kind of gives a broad overview of the methodology behind how we came up with a tool and some of the stuff that feeds into it. And then we'll just end up, and then lastly, measurement and monitoring, which is a pretty brief section because that's already statutory. It's just kind of a review of what's already in law. So let's talk about the background. One of the things in the plan talks about the state engineer's role with respect to the Great Salt Lake. As many of you know, if not most of you, the waters of the state are public, including the Great Salt Lake, the property of the public, and the state engineers are responsible for the general administration and supervision of those waters, including the measurement, appropriation, apportionment, and distribution. And customarily, the state engineer distributes water based on priority of the respective rights. It's often referred to as the principle of prior appropriation. Something that's unique to this plan is that the statute also requires us to incorporate the principle of multiple use sustained yield. So this is a different element that we're customarily have been using in other types of distribution plans. Because of the unique features of Great Salt Lake. The part of this section kind of covers the scope of the plan with respect to the Great Salt Lake. Obviously, Great Salt Lake fluctuates over time, sometimes pretty significantly. This plan has some benchmark elevations in the priority schedule. They're meant to kind of harmonize with other existing plans, such as the strategic plan, the Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan, but they're not necessarily the same. It applies to all Great Salt Lake water rights, and that there's a very specific definition as to what a Great Salt Lake water right is, and we'll get to that shortly. And it does not provide a priority call upstream of the Great Salt Lake. So we have this priority schedule with priority dates in it, but there is no priority call that extends upstream to upstream tributaries. There's some things that may be outside the scope of the state engineers' authorities with respect to the Great Salt Lake. Again, the plan primarily focuses on Great Salt Lake water rights and water dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. Most of the water in the Great Salt Lake is not associated with a Great Salt Lake water or dedicated water. It's just a standing pool of water. And so decisions or actions that don't relate to either those Great Salt Lake water rights or dedicated water are really the responsibility of the agency that's been statutorily mandated to regulate those. So those, things like management of the berm and those types of things don't fall under the purview of the state engineer, and this is kind of addressing that. Okay, moving on to section 2. Again, this just kind of lays out the mandate of the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan in respect to the relevant title of code. The primary objective is to establish those requirements for accurate measurement and quantification and reportance of diversion and depletions and return flows associated with those Great Salt Lake water rights, and then develop the procedures for the equitable apportionment and distribution of those rights. Some of the critical factors that we looked at are the physical characteristics of the lake itself, its elevation, its salinity levels. We looked at the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Strategic Plan and the Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan, and then just the characteristics of the individual Great Salt Lake water rights. Again, a specific type of right that we'll talk about shortly. So here's the definition of terms. The first one, dedicated water. So when you hear me talk about dedicated water, think of water rights that have gone through the change application process and have a signatory such as the Division of Wildlife Resources or Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. They're intended to benefit the lake. So when we talk about dedicated water, those are the types of water rights we're talking about. Those could be water rights that were moved from upstream to the Great Salt Lake, or water rights that were in situ in the lake that Forestry, Fire, State Lands have change applications on that would then dedicate them for use on sovereign lands. Comprehensive Management Plan, that's Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. The Great Salt Lake Meander Line, defined by statute. A Great Salt Lake water right, those are water rights that allow for diversion of surface or groundwater from a point below the meander line that contemplates recovery of salts or other mineral elements as defined by that code. So when we talk about Great Salt Lake water rights, we're primarily concerned about mineral extraction rights within the body of the Great Salt Lake. And the Great Salt Lake watershed, kind of self-explanatory. It's the Great Salt Lake Basin, including the Bear River, Jordan River, Weaver River, and West Desert. Here are the current list of Great Salt Lake water rights. So they're kind of arranged in priority, starting in most senior in the upper left-hand corner, and you read it down like a newspaper, to the most junior down the bottom right-hand corner. This will come into play when we talk about the priority schedule and the respective priority dates of those rights. Again, Great Salt Lake water rights are those associated with mineral extraction. As future administrative actions on Great Salt Lake water rights, whether that's new appropriations or change applications or ownership updates happen, we will amend the plan without going through the formal amendment process. It'll just be incorporated into the plan, so we don't have to go through the whole statutory process to kind of catch up to some of these administrative actions that happen frequently. Section 5, water dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. So these are the list of water rights and associated change applications that we have approved. Now, recognize there are some that are still pending. They're not on this table, so don't be too alarmed. These are also kind of listed in priority date of change. So the most senior, meaning that when the change application was filed, is in the upper left-hand corner. Again, read it like a newspaper. The most recent one would be down in the bottom right-hand corner. And you can see there's kind of an assortment of both fixed time change applications and permanent change applications. The fixed time change applications are designated with a lowercase f. permanent change applications are lowercase a. Again, dedicated water means those water rights that have gone through the change application process under Utah Code 73330, commonly referred to as the in-stream flow statute, which allows water to be used for the beneficial use on sovereign lands. One important feature of dedicated water is it's not available for diversion by Great Salt Lake water rights. So once it's colored in the lake, it's prohibited from being diverted for use for mineral extraction purposes. Again, as future change applications are approved, we will update this list without going through a formal amendment of the plan, again, because these are coming in all the time. We're acting on these on a regular basis, and so it didn't make sense to go through this whole statutory process just to update this table. Section 6, all right, this is when we kind of get into more of the weighty issues. There may be some questions as we get into the priority schedule itself. That'll take a little bit more explanation. So when we talk about apportioning water rights in the Great Salt Lake, we're really looking at two critical factors, that being the priority date of the underlying water right and a certain tiered elevation of the lake. So for general purposes, and we'll kind of get into the specifics here shortly, the more senior your water right is on the lake, the more available it's going to be at lower elevations of the lake. And again, we'll kind of get into the details. When we talk about the lake elevation, we're relying on the mean daily elevation of the south arm as measured by the USGS gauge at the Saltair Boat Harbor on June 15th of the previous year. Again, so the concept is we measure that elevation June 15th, and then the priority schedule comes into effect January 1 of the next year. That gives mineral extraction entities time to kind of understand what's going to happen in the following year and get caught up. It also aligns with Forestry and Fire State Lands, some of their deadlines for their mineral royalties. Great Salt Lake water rights that fall outside the elevation range listed in the priority schedule will be curtailed that calendar year. So again, if a lake is at a certain elevation and in that priority schedule a water right falls outside of that elevation range, it will be cut off January 1 of that next year. Okay? New appropriations for Great Salt Lake water rights. So many, if not all of you, know that the governor suspended new consumptive right appropriations in the Great Salt Lake. The proclamation does allow consideration for applications that have a mitigation plan that offset depletion. And so as these new applications are submitted for action by the state engineer, we'll consider them, the state engineer will consider them on their individual merits and identify where they fall in the priority schedule. Obviously, if they're new appropriations, they're going to be pretty junior in time. Great Salt Lake's water rights associated with dedicated water. So there's at least one approved change application for a mineral extraction entity that has a dedicated water component of it. And so they are, for those water rights where that has been the case, they have a voluntary arrangement with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, submitted a change application, it's been approved. They're identified with an asterisk in the priority schedule. There are only 3 rights currently so identified, as there are a few more change applications still in the process of being reviewed and acted on. As those are acted on, that table will be updated. And so the feature of that is the incentive for entering into these voluntary arrangements with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and filing a change application is that excludes them from the priority schedule. The expectation is Forestry, Fire, and State Lands will come up with some arrangement that protects the lake, maybe and a portion of the surplus water that's not used gets dedicated to the lake. And so they aren't subject to the same curtailment schedule as rights that do not have those change applications filed on them. Again, as future change applications are filed, we're going to go ahead and update the priority schedule without formal amendment of the plan. Okay, let's get into it. Here's the first portion of the priority schedule. So this is a little counterintuitive for people who maybe are kind of familiar with tables that look at lake elevations. This is kind of flipped. So we're looking at senior water rights at the top, and we have different tranches. And so as you go down, the lake elevation is actually going up in this table, okay? So you can see that first row, it says below 4193, and a corresponding column to the right of it says all Great Salt Lake water rights are curtailed unless they otherwise provided for an approved change application. So in essence, there will be no allowed diversion of any Great Salt Lake water rights if the lake is below that 4193. So for instance, this year, June 15th, 2025, the lake elevation was at 4193. Well, if it were 4192 in January, no, there would be no rights available for diversion unless they have that change application filed on them, okay? So that's the first tranche. So that's kind of the baseline of the priority schedule. We move into this next tranche, elevation from 4193 to 4194.9. And those are the lists of water rights off to the right that would be available for diversion when the lake elevation is within that range. You can see the 3 water rights kind of at the bottom associated with Compass Minerals that have the asterisks. That's the one that has the change application on it, okay? But they're still included in the priority schedule, even though because they have that change application, they're not subject to this. And as the lake increases in elevation, we move to the next tranche of water, 4195 to 4197.9. You can see this list is cumulative, so it has the rights that were available for diversion in the previous tranche and then adds a few more. You can see the priority dates in the column, and they kind of proceed from senior to junior. Similar with this, the next tranche, 4198 to 4199.9. Most of the rights most of the Great Salt Lake water rights are in this tranche available for diversion. Similar concept, these would be allowed to divert within that range. And then the final one is 4200 and above. It really only adds 2 more water rights to this tranche that are pretty junior in time. You'll note that one of those is owned by Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. That was dedicated to them by Compass. They segregated it off, and so at some point they will likely file a change application dedicating that to the lake. Oh, I don't want to speak for Forestry, Fire, State Lands, but that's what they've told me. So that's the priority schedule. Do you have any questions? Because I know that may not be super intuitive. I'm happy to spend a little bit more time on this if there are any questions. Chris?
Like how this plan is adopted, what's the legal underpinning for not allowing diversion based on lake level? Is there that sort of altering the fire appropriation doctrine?
That's a great question. So his question is, what's the legal framework that the state engineer is using to regulate water rights based on anything other than priority? And you remember me mentioning that the statute directs the state engineer to also consider multiple use sustained yield. And so that was the framework in which we're able to use lake elevations in conjunction with priority date to regulate water rights.
I look at a few of these, emphasis on it. Is the prioritization by date of application or by date of approval by the engineer?
So the question is what the priority date relates to. Is the priority date the date that the application was filed or the date the application was approved? Priority dates relate back to the date the application was filed. We can come back to that, but any other questions? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about voluntary arrangements. So the distribution management plan allows for voluntary arrangements. There are existing voluntary arrangements between Forestry, Fire, State Lands, and Great Salt Lake water rights. So they're incorporated into the plan as well as into the model. Again, they would be associated with an approved change application. So currently we only have one that's been approved, but there are other voluntary arrangements and corresponding change applications that have been filed for some of these rights. They differ on a case-by-case basis. usually, Forestry Fire State Lands makes sure that the contractual obligations align with the objectives of the plan and vice versa, and the objectives of the lake. If there are any voluntary arrangements proposed following the plan, state engineer will consider them on their own merits, just as we would with any other type of change application. Distribution accounting tool. And I'll walk through the actual tool. But this kind of gives you some methodology behind the development of the tool. So in the tool, we use two USGS gauges to calculate the volume of water in the lake. So you'll recall that when we're talking about lake level, we're only referring to the south arm, the one at Saltaire Boat Harbor. But when we're talking about the volume of the lake, we actually use the one near Saline as well to make sure we get the north arm and south arm, so we can calculate the volume of the Great Salt Lake. And that's important because we need to understand the volume so we can understand some of these other factors that come into play, such as evaporation, as well as other things. Salinity plays a role in how we calculate evaporation. So we report it for informational purposes, but also to help us calculate that. We're using the salinity in the south arm, and in the north arm is a little bit trickier because there's not really a USGS gauge that measures that, but David's been scraping or getting data from the UGS for salinity in the north arm, but we'll continue to use those two different salinity measurements in order to calculate the evaporation rate. The Great Salt Lake water rights, we determine the volume of water available for diversion under those rights based on the priority schedule, based on what the lake elevation is, while also incorporating those voluntary arrangements and change applications. We use the USGS bathymetry to evaluate the volume of the lake. Again, important in understanding what water is available for diversion by Great Salt Lake water rights. And then we also identify and track the volume of dedicated water. And we also use the evaporation rates to kind of figure out what amount of dedicated water is remaining for the next year to start with. And so the approach that we're using to calculate how much is lost to the dedicated water is, if you think of the Great Salt Lake, and if there's water put in the Great Salt Lake, it expands its surface area by just a little bit. And so we're really looking at the surface area, the expanded surface area, and using the evaporation off of that and assigning a evaporative loss to the dedicated water component. That'll be a little bit more clear when I go through the model itself. That's a QR code for the model. Again, I'll show you how to get to it from our homepage, but you have the handout. You can go there. It's live, ready to go, and ready to review. But we'll go there shortly after I finish up this last section on measurement and monitoring. In the plan, it really just refers to the statutory provisions that this plan requires robust physical measurement, not just estimation of water being diverted from Great Salt Lake, and continual reporting. We are already receiving reporting from Great Salt Lake water rights. This just kind of confirms that that's the case, and also pushes them to make sure that we're getting physical measurement. In some instances, operators have been using estimates, how long has the pump been on, and the volume of it. This will require physical measurement of the water. Also, the statute requires measurement, reporting, and discharge salinity to Forestry Fire State Lands. And then there are some other measurement requirements associated with DEQ and other regulatories. And it's just saying, hey, notwithstanding what's in the plan, you're still obligated to report these other measurements to the respective regulatory agency. Okay, timeline and next steps. So today's the July 31st, it's a public meeting. I mailed it out this morning, the notice of final adoption. I know that might get you a little bit nervous. So we're required to send notice 60 days prior to the adoption. So that mailing went out. Again, we have 60 days. It doesn't become adopted until October 1st, so we can still receive feedback. and of course adoption on October 1st. There is a 60-day complaint period after final adoption. Any aggrieved parties, they have 60 days from the date of adoption to file a complaint in district court to, I guess, protest the plan itself. There's the QR code to the management plan website itself, and you can send mail to this mail address, comments if you'd like, or email. So with that, I think if Paul will change the screen to my monitor here, I'll take us through the distribution model, unless there's any questions currently. And we'll have time for questions later as well, but if there's any burning questions, okay. Move the mic over here. Okay, first I just wanted to show you how to navigate to the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan webpage from our homepage. So this is our landing page. If you, oh, hey, Paul, can you present this to the monitors as well? What's on my screen? There we go. Okay, here we are. Here's the homepage. So if you scroll down to water rights and select this, so you can see where my cursor is, and then scroll down to the bottom to management plans, and then distribution plans. And then you'll see the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan here. That brings you to the landing page for this plan. You'll see our public meetings links there, as well as a copy of the draft plan on that link. Also includes the list of Great Salt Lake water rights, the list of dedicated water, and then also the voluntary arrangements that Forestry and Fire State Lands has entered into with various mineral companies. And then at the very bottom is the actual distribution accounting tool, which we'll kind of dive into. So this is the landing page. Yeah, please.
If I'm understanding the presentation correctly, it was for voluntary arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
Are included in this plan, and future voluntary agreements could be included on a case-by-case basis as determined by the state water engineer.
So the question is, so it's understanding that these are the 4 voluntary arrangements that we have so far. That is correct, that have been entered into. They are incorporated into the plan with a caveat that only one of these actually has an approved change application on it yet. So only the Compass Minerals is the only one with an approved change application. There have been change applications filed with these other voluntary arrangements though as well. And once those...
Because of the date they started the negotiation?
They're included just for informational purposes. The voluntary arrangements, you'll see they're essentially a contract between the mineral extraction entity and Forestry and Fire State Lands. The change application is what we look at from an administrative point of view when we're tying it to the distribution management plan. So for the time being, Compass Minerals is the only one that has one of those tied to their voluntary arrangements that have been approved. There have been some filed.
I looked really quickly at a couple of them. I'm assuming that they all have a similar structure, namely, depending upon the levels of the lake, they're allowed a certain amount of use so they can feed water.
Correct. Yeah, I think they are mostly framed very similarly with a few exceptions, but here's kind of the crux of the lake elevation and what they're allowed to divert. The balance of what they don't divert for mineral extraction would then be converted to dedicated water. So in this case, this water right is for 156,000 acre feet, and so as the tiers go down based on the elevations under this voluntary agreement, they would be able to use a portion of that for mineral extraction, and then the balance would be converted in situ to water for beneficial use on sovereign lands. You bet. Oh, yeah.
Bruce Anderson, Mineral Resources. North Shore is listed on the list with one of the water rights holders. Question is, do all of the water rights holders have the same, is it the same elevation and the same percentages of the total that are applied, or is that varying?
So the question is whether all the Great Salt Lake water right owners have the same percentages for the same elevations. So I just want to tease out what you're asking about, if you're talking about the voluntary arrangements or if you're talking about our priority schedule. They have there are 3 that are very similar, and this is probably an answer that Ben can give you better than I. My review of them, there are 3 that are very similar, and then one that's just a little bit different, but they all have the similar elevation thresholds, but there may be a slight difference in the amount of water they can divert within those ranges.
Percentages of the total might be off a little bit.
I think in one of them is, the rest it's typically 30%, 50%, 83%, and then all depending on the lake level. But, Ben's going to be your guy to get a better answer on that. Or you can just look at the voluntary arrangements themselves. Okay, let's get back to the accounting model. So this first tab, so what we really hope to do is at some point get, and I don't want to use the term Great Salt Lake Commissioner because we have a Great Salt Lake Commissioner and he's not going to be entering in this data, but someone who, we typically have commissioners on river systems that would enter in distribution accounting data. And so we anticipate doing a similar concept, having an employee of the state engineer or the state who would then be able to reach out to the different distribution systems on the Jordan River, the Weber River, the Bear River, see what dedicated water has been delivered to the Great Salt Lake, get those numbers and put them into this. We've preloaded this with historical water that's been delivered to the lake, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But this initial tab is really for accounting purposes for the commissioner to enter into data. So there may not be, you're certainly welcome to peek through these and see kind of the inner workings of the accounting model if you like, but there's probably not going to be a lot of intuitive reports that you're going to be able to glean a lot from. The next one is the accounting calculations. This is, again, something that you may not really be interested in, but if you wanted to understand how our model works, specifically as it relates to looking at evaporative losses or those types of things, this is essentially the code for how the distribution accounting model is built. So if there's any of you data wonks out there that really want to dig in and try to make heads or tails of this, good luck. But David Jones can certainly answer any questions, but this just kind of helps explain the methodology behind the tool itself. The bulk of what you may be interested in are going to be these things called accounting reports. And so you'll see up here in the upper left-hand corner, you can toggle between different years, okay? I'm going to toggle to 2024 just because we have all that data, and go to the Great Salt Lake elevations. And this will show the elevation of the north arm and the south arm. And then you can probably barely make it out. There's a dashed line below either of those. And so that's the elevation that the lake would be at in these respective arms without dedicated water. So if you put your cursor here, you can see in the south arm on June 7th, 2024, it would be 4195 was the measured elevation. And then without dedicated water, it would be, a couple tenths lower, okay? Same thing on the north arm. Now, the Great Salt Lake water rights, you'll see it's blank here. It's because we don't have data for 2024 because we didn't have the priority schedule, right? It hasn't been adopted. So this, assuming it gets adopted October 1st, which is our intention, this is what the accounting of the Great Salt Lake water rights would look like. And I'm going to go through this because it's probably a little bit confusing. But if you see on the first column, it's essentially coupled by different Great Salt Lake water owners, right? Water right owners. So Lake Crystal, Earth Elements, North Shore, Salt Point, Compass Minerals. The next column is the respective water right number with a URL link if you want to go to the web page for that water right. The volume associated with that respective water right. In some cases, you'll see there's a little footnote 2. In some cases, we only had CFS flow rates as tied to these water rights, so they've done some calculation, multiplied the CFS times 365 24/7 to get a volumetric limitation. And then the next column is, hey, when is that water right available for diversion, for mineral extraction? And so you can see that first one, Lake Crystal, would only be available for diversion when the lake is at 4193 of the previous year at June 15th. And you can see down here, so this is 2025, so we're looking at June 15th of 2024, as you can see here, okay? So keep in mind, and at that time, the lake was at 4195. The south arm at Saltair Boat Harbor was 4195. And so using this logic, it will tell you, okay, during the calendar year of 2025, is this water right available for diversion for mineral extraction? And it's a yes or no, okay? And so you can see, well, this right allows them to divert when the lake elevation is above 4193, so it's on. This one only allows them to divert when the lake elevation is above 4198, so it's off. And then it kind of says, all right, this is how much they are authorized to divert in 2025, okay? So that holds pretty steady until you get down to Compass Minerals. Remember, they're the ones that have this voluntary arrangement with an approved change application. And so their diversion schedule is different than the priority schedule. Remember, they're carved out of the priority schedule by virtue of having this voluntary arrangement and change application. And so their tiers, as presented in the voluntary arrangement and as approved in the change application, are different. You can see that they can actually divert when the lake is just above 4190, right? So different than anyone else. Everyone else is cut off at below 4193, but they can only divert a portion of their portfolio. So they only get 46,800 acre feet when the lake's at that elevation. And so you can see down here that 3 of their 4 water rights, or excuse me, 3 of their 4 tiers, they're available to divert, and leaving this 26,000 acre feet in the lake. Now that 26,000 feet becomes important because that's the water that gets converted in situ and becomes dedicated water. And so this is the concept. This is where you would go to see, all right, am I in priority? As a mineral extraction agency, what am I authorized to divert this year, okay? And you can see Compass has other water rights. Some are turned on, some are turned off, depending on the lake elevation. So that's this table. Again, remember, we're looking at 2025, so it's calling back to June 5th, 2024 for that lake elevation to determine where they fit on the priority schedule. And you can, we can't do it for past years because this is going into effect October 1, so 2025 is really the only year this matters about. But these other reports, you can go back, you can chase them back further. This is the Great Salt Lake volume, again, using the bathymetry and the lake elevations. So if you're interested to see what the lake is currently at, I think it was around 9.1 million acre feet currently if you take the north arm and the south arm. But this might be just useful information if you're just interested to know what the volume of the lake is. And then Great Salt Lake salinity, again, we capture this data from USGS, North Arm. We've had to do some extrapolation because there isn't a continuum monitoring site there, but we're going to work with UGS to see what we can do to scrape that data more frequently. But to be truth, the North Arm is hypersaline. The evaporation rates don't fluctuate a whole lot based on how saline it is, so it's not a huge factor in determining the evaporative losses to dedicated water. The accounting summary. This is what we call a teacup diagram. You can see this teacup, there's a lot of white space. So that's essentially, if that whole cup was full, that would mean the lake is filled up. The blue water is all that water that is available for diversion by mineral extraction agencies if they're in priority. And that red sliver is the amount of dedicated water that we've currently have accounted for in the lake. So right now we're looking at 161,000 acre feet of dedicated water in the lake. You can see down here, it had a beginning balance beginning at January 1 of 2025 of 161,668. This is that 26,000 acre feet that was converted in situ from the Compass Minerals change application. So that's why that's there. You see a bunch of zeros. That's because we won't do the accounting for this until 2025 is done, and then we can get the commissioner reports from the Weber River, from the Jordan River, from the Bear River, and back calculate and put them in to know what water was delivered to the lake. So at the end of the calendar year, and once the commissioners on those respective systems have finalized their reporting, we'll get that data and plug it in here. So this will be updated on a year-to-year basis. But we can go back to 2024 and you can kind of see what water was delivered from those various different sources. So you can see all of those, the beginning year balance from 2023, all the water that was delivered via those change applications, and then the evaporative losses associated with the dedicated water they're subtracting from. So it's just kind of a basic math equation to where you get the end of year balance. Any questions on this? Okay. The accounting details, this is just kind of like a balance sheet, so for 2024, you can see all these evaporative losses happening on a daily basis. Again, this isn't the whole lake. This isn't evaporation for the whole lake. This is just for that little tree ring around the lake that was increased by virtue of the dedicated water and the evaporation coming off of that. So you can scroll down. You're going to have to scroll down through a year's worth of evaporative losses until you kind of get to the bottom, and it will show the additions to the account associated with that dedicated water. And you can see down here, it starts off with a balance, around 79.4 thousand acre feet. It attrits, goes down as the evaporative losses happen. And then at the end of the year, you can see, or at the beginning of the next year, that addition of that 26,000 acre feet, so it jumps up from the Compass Minerals change application, which becomes effective. And so if we go to 2025, it will start off at that balance in that graph. You see we're up here 161,000 acre feet. And again, evaporative losses, you see the gentle decline of the balance of dedicated water. This just shows how we calculate evaporation. I won't go into the details. Essentially, it's relying on David Tarbotton's method using salinity. So this is just the approach we landed on. We understand that there are efforts to refine the approach to calculate evaporation on the lake. We just wanted to, hey, we're going to use this until better approaches happen. And if they do happen, we'll update the model with those approaches and document it accordingly. So that's the tour of the distribution accounting model. What questions, if any, do you have for me? Yeah.
That one sheet, whether it said it was off or on,
Uh-huh.
is that in the packet?
It's not in the packet.
Can I take a photo of that?
You can access this online.
Oh, it's all on.
This is, yeah. So if you go back to that, here, I'll just type it in here. Here's the landing page for the distribution management plan. You go all the way down to the bottom. That's where you'll find the tool. It's open to the public. You guys can get in there, look around, digest it, see how it's going to impact your own industry or anything, or see the dedicated water. We think this will be a very useful tool for transparency, understanding what water has been moved to the lake and been tracked in the lake. And I think we can, have more coherent conversations around dedicated water in the lake. And so we're all using the same numbers that the state engineer is tracking. So any other questions? Not nearly as many questions as I thought I might get. So you're either scared to ask or you understand it all. Chris.
Like, it seems to me like this is going to be a really great tool for dealing with low lake elevations and managing, the resource. It's going to be painful, but it seems like it's a pretty rational tool.
Yeah, and so Chris was just extolling the virtues of this tool, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think I think if nothing else, it paints the picture that the wisdom of the legislature adopting this statute and adopting the measure to implement this plan to protect and preserve the lake, considering its condition and the valuable resource it is to the state. I think so. I agree. I hope it does as well, and I think it does. I think it will. Any other questions? Okay. With that, Paul, we can go ahead. Is there any online questions? I didn't see any hands.
We have one online.
Okay.
Go ahead, James.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, James.
Hi, Blake. Hey, I just want to understand if I understood you correctly. So if I were to look at the June 15th, 2025 water elevation, that's what's going to set what's going to happen next year in 2026?
That is correct. If I recall, the June 15th, 2025 lake elevation was 4193 on the money. And so that's right on that threshold for that lower tier. So yes.
So if I were to look at 4193 in the table in your presentation, it would easily show me what rights would be curtailed based on that water elevation.
Correct. So it would be that second tranche of rights, or, if we say the first tranche is everything's curtailed, it would be the next tranche of rights that are allowable for diversion. I think it's 4193 to 4194.9.
So no matter what happens that current winter for the next year, it'll all be based on that value.
That is correct.
Okay. Where were you talked in your presentation about those given elevations that were determined based on others, agreements and things, the different curtailment elevations. Is there more detail somewhere on the website or more where those actual elevations were determined by the state?
So the elevation thresholds themselves come from, I think the strike team report, the strategic plan kind of benchmark those specific elevations. Now, if you're saying the elevations as they relate to specific water rights and those voluntary arrangements are on the website, and they have those in there and the respective percent of the water right allowable for diversion for that voluntary arrangement. So I'm not sure which question you were asking. Hopefully I answered it.
Yeah, not so much the voluntary arrangements, but those lake elevations in comparison to which rights you decided to curtail. What logic or how did that come about to determine, this set of priority dates would go with this lake elevation and this one with that one? Is there more detail of how you guys came up with those values?
There isn't more detail. There was a general concept that these voluntary arrangements with forestry fire state lands were developed first, and they had specific percentage thresholds tied to those elevations. And so we used those to help shape the cutoff points for where we would say these rights are available for diversion, but it's not documented.
All right, thank you. Those are my questions.
Peter, I believe you're next, if you would like to raise your question.
Thanks. Maybe you have said this explicitly, but my ears need to hear it one more time. Is it correct that I get the whole June 15th applies to the following year, but basically your implementation of this distribution management plan will start January 1st, 2026. Is that accurate?
Yes, thanks. That's a great question, and yes, that is correct. The plan will be adopted October 1st, and we will begin managing the Great Salt Lake water rights on January 1st, 2026, based on the June 15th, 2025 elevation of the South Arm.
Right. I had to hear for sure that you weren't going to pull the carpet from out of us and as of October 1st say, guess what, you should have used this year. I know, sounds ridiculous, but I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, no, thanks for good clarifying question. Chris, and then we'll go to you.
Like, do you anticipate a lot of headwinds or legal challenges to this? You've got a 60-day comment period, and you feel like that you've done enough groundwork that it's going to be unscathed? Do you think you're in for some trouble?
His question is whether we're in trouble or not, or whether this will be controversial or not. We put a lot of work into this. We think it's based on sound legal principles, and we stand by it. If there are people who wish to challenge it, I guess that's to be seen, and we'll have to deal with that if that's the case.
So if I understand this correctly, if there's a voluntary agreement in place, that becomes the guiding document, not the overarching, or
The priority schedule.
yeah, the priority schedule. But then if we've got a voluntary agreement in
Yeah, so his question was again, if there's a voluntary agreement in place, that supersedes the priority schedule. And I say, with a caveat that there's an approved change application tied to that voluntary agreement. So yeah, they go hand in hand. So without an approved change application, those are just voluntary agreements between the Mineral Agency and Forestry and Fire State Lands, aren't bearing on the state engineer. So there really needs to be an approved change application tied to it.
So that's how the one you showed, I think it was Compass at 46,000 acre feet that had above 4190 instead of the standard 4193. That's how they were able to leapfrog down.
Yeah, and so Chris is just pointing out that that voluntary arrangement and change application is the reason why that example of Compass Minerals change application had different elevation thresholds tied to it compared to the others. That is correct. Are there any other questions online? Oh, got one more in the room.
Hi, Kelly Hanna. Is there an accounting for the elevation of the berm or the elevation of the north arm? Feels like that's missing.
So his question is whether there's an accounting for the elevation of the berm or the elevation of the north arm. Well, why are we missing that? So we do account for it when we're considering Great Salt Lake volumes, the elevation of the north arm. But we're relying on one elevation of the south arm to dictate how the management plan rolls out the following year. That's consistent with Forestry Fire State Lands and their elevations that they used in their voluntary arrangements. We felt it was best to stay unified and avoid confusion. As far as the management berm, there's no consideration. That's purely peer review of Forestry Fire State Lands of how they manage that berm, and so it's not an element considered in the plan. Anything else? Lynn?
Could you define again water dedicated to Great Salt Lake?
Well, will I define water dedicated to Great Salt Lake? I'm going to have to pull up the definition. Why don't we circle back to it? Hey, Paul, can you present the presentation for me? There we go. Let's just go back to it so we can all kind of. I was just going back to section 3 here. Dedicated water, right? Oh, hey, Paul, can you present my presentation, please? Thanks. Okay, here we are. Dedicated water. It's the quantity of water approved for delivery to or in the Great Salt Lake under water rights approved for beneficial use by a division as defined in subsection 73.301, or excuse me, 73.331B. So essentially those are water rights that have a change application under that in-stream flow statute. And so they would have to be approved and dedicated to Great Salt Lake. So essentially their destination is for use on sovereign lands within Great Salt Lake. So that's what we say, what we're talking about when we talk about dedicated water. We've had a number of those over the last few years. Does that answer your question, Lynn? Certainly. Anything else? Happy to stick around and answer some questions offline if you so choose. We have I got some time, but why don't we go ahead and we'll go, unless there's anything else online, we'll go ahead and conclude this meeting for now. Appreciate you all coming out, and we'll stick around to answer any questions. Thanks, everyone.